All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our pre-districts judge panel. So my name is Sean Bailey, and I'll be helping mediate this call. But we have three incredible judges joining us today, so I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So Alex, can you start us off?
Alex Malott, I've been involved in DECA now going on almost 15 years, four as a DECA competitor myself, and then 11 in various volunteer capacities. Really excited to chat with you all here. I've been a friend of Massachusetts for several years and happy to give you all some advice today.
Great. Jeffrey.
Hello, everyone. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Uh, Jeffrey Grant. I've been volunteering as a judge for DECA for 5 or 6 years now. I've done, I think, all the levels up to ICDC at this point. So, looking forward to helping out.
Great. Thank you. And then Key.
Hi, I'm Katie Sims. I first judged DECA almost 20 years ago, I believe, and I've done it sort of on and off ever since, pretty consistently for the last 5 years or so. I judge districts, states, and I've done papers for ICDC. I do papers and live judging at all levels, so I've done in pretty much every category. So.
All right, great. I just want to start off by saying thank you to the judges who came and helped out. I know you guys are really busy, so I really appreciate you guys coming and helping us out. So I'll start off with a few quick questions to get the ball rolling, and then I'll open it up to everyone. So one of my first questions is, what do you think is the best way to differentiate yourself? We know that judges are there for a long time, spending all day listening to the same projects or role play over and over again. What do you guys think the best way to differentiate ourselves is?
I'll jump in. I think one of the things, particularly if you've got a prepared presentation, and you're working on it and you're practicing or you're, doing it for somebody in advance, if you find that while you're doing it, you're bored, then the judge is probably going to be bored. So, if there's parts where you just feel like, oh, this is really boring, try to find a way to make it a little bit more interesting. Keeping engaging as much as possible, I think really makes a difference. You remember the groups that really, you know, whether you throw a little bit of humor in there, whether, you just kind of stay engaging. That's a big plus.
One thing I'll piggyback off of what Katie said, kind of taking that engaging thing, 100% echo that for prepared events. What I found is you can also use it for your role play style events too. And what I mean by, keeping it engaging and working with the judge is, take the first 15, 20 seconds as soon as you sit down with the judge and, thank them for their time. Thank them for being there. How was the drive in today? Really, really appreciate you sitting down to talk through ideas today. And then what I also see sometimes students do that's really effective too at breaking up the monotony, especially for role play events, is, they'll get a couple minutes through or a couple KPIs through and they'll pause for like 10 or 15 seconds and say, what do you think of everything so far? Sounding pretty great, right? And it helps kind of for you to help collect your thoughts as well, but also to keep in mind the judge is hearing the same general stuff, especially for a role play event over and over all day, sometimes going from 8 a.m. all the way till 6 p.m. at night. So those little things like that just help a judge break away from it mentally.
Yeah, and I will say, for me, one of the big things that makes groups stand out when I'm judging presentations, if they are conversational or if they sound conversational when they're presenting, because there are a lot of teams and a lot of groups that will memorize a script, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with scripting out your presentation and preparing what you say. But the people who stand out are the ones who can memorize a script and then deliver it as if they're talking rather than as they're reciting. The more you sound like you're having a conversation versus reading prepared words or giving a prepared speech, the more it makes you stand out when you're presenting. And like I said, there's nothing wrong if you need to memorize the script and memorize your main points, but the best presenters are the people who can internalize the knowledge, speak to it because they know it, and also be able to pivot if there's a question or if they get interrupted and they can just pick right back up and not make it obvious that you threw them off their script. And I know I don't do this, but there are some judges who are a little more sadistic about it who will purposely interrupt teams in the middle of their presentation just to see how badly they get thrown off and if they can recover from
Yeah.
it.
All right, great answers. All right, I'll ask one more question and then I'll open it up to the group. So whether it be projects or role plays, what is the biggest like red flag for you guys where like if you see it, you know like it's not going to be a good role play or presentation if it means like no handshake or something along those lines, what do you guys think is like the biggest like warning sign?
For written events, I would say specifically for me, an over reliance on visuals. Um, I've seen students at various levels that come in and they'll have, PowerPoints that they will be completely reading off, or they are so dependent on that visual aid as a crutch to their ideas. If you actually look at the rubric, your visual aids, your presentation, or, the pitch deck is the new thing that everyone's worrying about this year, that only counts for a small portion of the overall, the design, how fancy it looks, how many different visuals you have. I want to hear your ideas. So your presentation, your pitch deck, your visuals should add to what you're presenting, should give me a high level summary. And it should not detract from the content that you're bringing me, to the similar points that Jeffrey had. Be conversational with me. Act like, we're having a friendly chat. You're educating me on something. Don't When it starts to feel like it's too prepared, too polished, that's where it gets a little worrying to me because that makes me think as a judge, okay, you know how to memorize this stuff, but if I'm going to ask you a question that may be outside what you've prepared, how are you going to do?
I was gonna say too, yeah, anyone who's reading, everything versus just, if you have, it's best if you can be completely off script. In my opinion, I think just it's really hard when somebody is relying so heavily on whether their cue cards or their visual project. It just sort of creates a barrier between the judge, and the presenter in a way that you just don't get that interactive, feel. So if the more you know it, the better. I would also say that when teams are really imbalanced, when one person seems to be doing all the talking, um, it doesn't come across great in the presentation, whether it's a role play or a prepared presentation.
Yeah, so Katie and Alex already hit my two big ones. I will add this is more of a yellow flag than a red flag, maybe, but if a team gets up and starts presenting and they are talking at warp speed, I immediately get worried because that means you are trying to dump way too much information in the 5 or 10 minutes you have, and I know I'm going to get lost just because whatever you're presenting, I may know the general topic, but you're going to be moving so fast that I'm not going to be able to pick up on all the details. I know for certain you're not going to leave me any time for questions. So, yeah, if a team gets up and you're speaking as fast as you possibly can to try to cram everything into your presentation limit time, that immediately clicks in my head that okay, this is not going to be the best experience I've ever had.
Great answers. All right, so now I'm gonna open it up to anyone who has any questions. So please raise your hand on like the Zoom button, like hit the react button, then hit raise hand. And I'll be calling on everyone. All right, Victoria.
Hello, I'm Victoria. I'm doing personal financial literacy. I have a question like on how to be the creative during your role play because I especially have trouble with that, or like how to make your time more effective for your notes.
One of the first tips I did, so when I was in DECA, I did exclusively role play events all my 4 years. And the first thing that I would do, to your point about being effective with taking notes, the very first thing I do in the first minute I get in is I take all of the KPIs, the four, five, six, however many I have, and I rewrite them into my own words, on a sheet of paper, one, two, three, four, five. And I use that to help structure my thoughts and also make sure that my thoughts are going back to what the rubric says 90% of my score is going to be based on. And then as the thoughts start to swirl through your brain and as you start to jot down your talking points, how you're going to cover particular things, then the creativity starts to come in and I start to think, okay, here's the little thing that I can scribble together on a chart that makes sense, or here's the little example social media graphic or the sample financial report I can give. The one thing I always tell people that's the obvious thing too is ideas first, your visuals second. So I will usually allot for, and I practice this with role plays where I'll spend, if I've got the 10-minute prep time, I'll spend 8 minutes putting together everything. And then the last 2 minutes while I'm sitting there is where I put together my visuals. And again, remember, the judge, they don't need to be perfect. They don't need to be top of the notch. I had one group, actually, it was in another state, that had a really creative thing they did with just their last couple minutes. And it wasn't fancy graphics or different things like that. They just drew together a little donut and a cup of coffee and brought that in and said, "Hey, I brought donuts and coffee for our meeting today." It was a super cute thing, and it got me to remember at the end of the day as I met with all these different students. I'm like, oh, that's the one that just had something really creative. And that's the thing that could give you the difference, especially as judges rescore, because that's one thing that not a lot of students know is that we're told to consistently, work through our scores and evaluate throughout the day. The first people that we get, we might think are the very best. But then at the end of the day, we might have a completely different set of students that completely knock the socks off of us. So those
Is
little things. Go ahead.
I don't know if someone else was going to jump in, but I just
is
wanted
a
to pick.
business card being like creative? Like
Okay.
creating a business card is
Oh,
some
I'll answer that question, but I just first want to piggyback on what Alex was saying is um, I do think the creativity is important, but that can come more in the really jumping in and really, particularly with role plays, really put yourself in the role play. If you can kind of allude to something where you're really like making it clear that you understood what the role play is about and you're in that moment, the more you can be in sort of that, make it more of a realistic moment, that definitely helps. But don't do that to the detriment of missing things on the rubric entirely. I've had groups that have come in and they're enthusiastic and they're creative and their final solution is great. But one of the things on the rubric would have been something like, describe the nature of a budget and how it, applies to this topic. And they don't mention a budget once. And it's really, really hard to score well when you've completely jumped over an entire category. So these groups that seem great and are very, present well and are well spoken and have these great creative ideas don't score nearly as high as someone who just made sure to hit every single element of the KPIs. So I would say that's number one. And then the creativity could be more in just really selling your solution. Don't try to get to the end first. Really work through it. And I know there's not a lot of time, but the more you can hit each of those things, and I know sometimes they feel a little stilted or awkward because it might be, define some term, but you can always do that in a very casual, as you're aware, this means this, or like, as you're obviously very familiar with, just make sure you don't just jump over it. And you never know, the judge may not really be that aware of that particular term, depending on how close their professional background is to what they're judging. So,
And to piggyback off of that, something I like what you said, Katie, about putting yourself in the role, because there's one thing I noticed, especially last year doing state and international judging, which is that too many students forgot what role they were and also forgot what role the judge was supposed to be playing. The dynamics of that are entirely different. There are some role plays that you'll get where you are senior to the judge, for example, where you're supposed to be a more tenured employee. You might be the boss of the judge, and the judge is a customer or a lower level employee, or the inverse might be true. So it's important to put yourself in the shoes of what role are you playing? And, just like we all like to do when we were younger, this is your time to pretend and be someone and be that person in that role.
I didn't answer your question either about the business card. To be honest, I feel like you get a lot of business cards, if you've been there all day, that won't, it can't hurt, but it's not necessarily going to be the one thing. If you've got time to put more time into, really fleshing out your answers versus trying to create this beautiful business card, do the former and not the latter, be my.
This is my first role play, so it's like my first ever experience. And I did a practice role play, but didn't go as well as expected, but I got all the vocab in, so like this is my first one, so it's a bit nerve-wracking to go in front of a judge.
Yeah, no, this is why we do the judge panel because it is oftentimes a little bit intimidating to talk to judges. So this is why we like to do this to hear what they have to say. So I'll move on to the next question.
Thanks
So
so much for the tips.
yeah, of course. All right. Simon.
Yeah, hi. This is actually a question I've had for a little while now. So I know that the judges grade you a lot also on how like well you play into your role, however, and like charisma, just how well you overall play into your role. So I was actually curious, does the way you dress during the interview at all like impact how they give you an overall score? Like just as like playing into the role. Does how you dress at all affect what the judges think of you?
I'll
Um,
jump in. Yes, but probably not to the extent that of the time that you're spending on it. Particularly in team activities, I feel like teams spend a lot of time. Some of them are trying to match exactly, or let's wear the same exact, you know, suit. They go shopping together, and realistically, in the business world, when you're presenting, you're not going to necessarily be, call up your colleague and say, "Hey, let's make sure we dress exactly alike to go present this." I think, as long as you're dressed professionally, it's nice if, like, I do think it's nice when teams coordinate, if it kind of ties into their project, is they all wear the same color tie or some such thing. But as long as you're dressed professionally, you're groomed professionally, I wouldn't overthink it. I think it's such a small part of only one category typically in the rubric that there's just better places to spend your energy.
Yeah,
I would,
but oh, sorry.
I do want to add, not contradicting what Katie said, because yeah, overall um, the outfit and the visuals aren't one of the major things. However, it does pay, I think, to pay attention to what category you're in. Because, for example, if you're in a sales category, either for a paper presentation or a role play, sales outfits in the real world will sometimes do something like that, where their sales teams will have fully coordinated outfits or themed looks to them. So that can maybe give you a few extra points in the sales categories, especially if the judge is steeped in that world, they'll appreciate the effort. On the other hand, usually when I'm judging, I'm doing a project management category. Professional project managers are some of the most boring people you will ever meet. We don't care if you're dressed up in coordinated outfits. We don't care if you have a theme song. We just care that, excuse me, you don't look like you've come in off the street and you know what you're talking about. So I do think Katie had a good point. Overthinking your outfit to the point where you're spending more time on it than you are on learning your information is probably wasted effort. But also, depending on what category you're in, sometimes it might be worth it to put a few extra minutes into coordinating an outfit or coming up with a theme for how the team looks. But in some categories, it will really not affect anything one way or the other.
Here's the big high level picture to keep in mind, which, Jeff and Katie kind of alluded to. I'll be a little bit more explicit and kind of saying it. There is not a specific category, a specific rubric item that is how did you dress or evaluation of how you dress. However, just like in the real world, if you're interviewing for a job or something, I may have two excellent candidates who both do exceptionally well in the interview. One person is always going to get it versus the other person. And there can be a variety of factors that are not within your control. It could be that person dressed a little bit nicer, they had a nicer introduction, they were more conversational. So, yes, it's important. It's not necessarily a rubric item you're going to see, but it could make the difference in the judge's mind because judges are subjective. What matters to me and what's important to me may be different from like what Jeff said with a project manager. So, it's important to understand that dynamic, and they're the little things that can play in your favor.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Great. All right, Jivan.
Um, for this is my first year in DECA, and I'm doing Principles of Hospitality and Tourism. And I had two questions regarding it. First being, do you guys have any recommendations of how to structure your 10-minute time period? And second question being, when you're talking about your KPIs, do you want us to restate them or like kind of integrate them within our speech?
I can start, although I haven't done much with hospitality, but just in general, regardless of what kind of information you're conveying to the judge, and Katie, I think, touched on this earlier. I think Alex brought it up too, but if you can work it naturally into the conversation, it's always better than if you're obviously stopping and giving it as a definition. Like I don't want to say the worst thing, but sort of the most eye-rolling thing is if a presentation stops and the student goes, the definition of X term is blah, 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 which, by the letter of the rubric, you got the task done. But nobody in real life will ever do that in a business presentation or a sales presentation. So it's always better as much as possible to work the KPIs into the presentation naturally. Now you can call them KPIs because that's a real business term that people use. But I would avoid in general reading them out verbatim. Maybe summarize them, truncate them, and give them as quick bullet points. Don't read them through.
Put them in your own words.
Yeah, that's the best thing you can do.
But
As far as the overall structure, I'll be done quickly, and Alex and Katie can jump in because they might have more to say. The overall structure is really up to you. The biggest thing is just like Katie said, don't skip anything that's on the rubric. Most of the rubrics are sort of in a logical order as you read them anyway. So following the order that they present there usually won't steer you wrong. It's not rigid. If you're really confident about what you're talking about, you can play around with the order. But if you need just a starting point because you're completely lost, just go in the order of the rubric and use that as sort of your starting structure.
yeah, that's what I was gonna, you kind of got back to it, but definitely, I do think usually following the rubric does get you there pretty well. I feel like the teams that struggle the most are the ones that don't really look at that and are just trying to solve whatever the issue is, particularly with, they jumping to the end. And if you don't know a better way than to say the definition of, it's better to do that than to not say it at all because it's almost impossible to earn any points when you don't mention, whatever the particular indicator is. So it's best if you can work it in naturally, but don't just skip over it for fear of sounding, weird, because you're going to give the judge more to work with saying it than not.
Whatever structure you do, though, I will say this, have some structure and order to your thoughts. There are a lot of students I work with that will jump around, from different things. And okay, now I'm talking about this, and then I'm going to kind of go over here, and then I'm going to kind of, oh, there's one thing I forgot. I want to jump back over here. It makes it very difficult not only for you to keep track and piece together what you're talking about, but it also makes it harder for the judge to follow, okay, well, where does that fit in? Where does this fit in here?
And in a team, that's where you can sort of cue each other to, you're going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about this. And then when you're before the judge, it's okay to say, and now, my colleague is going to talk to you about, whatever the next one is. So it kind of clues the judge in, like, hey, now we're going to cover this, so that they're ready to hear it. And so that when they go back, I mean, I know for me personally, and I know every judge does it a little bit differently, but I don't like to have the computer sort of in between me and the team. It's sort of to the side. I'm taking notes. I'm able to look at and engage with. But then I need to remember what they've, as soon as they leave, I then will go ahead and score them. It's almost easier if they've kind of introduced the topic, so that I can say, "Oh, yep, they talked about this. That's when they got into this part of it." So you can kind of bounce that off of each other, and that way you're covering it as well.
Great. All right, Dana.
Hi, so I'm doing a community awareness, which is a prepared event, and I just want to know, like, how many questions would a judge ask, or like, what are some possible questions that a judge could ask?
That's I mean, for prepared events, it's completely up to the judge. I'll just quickly cover for role plays. Judges, for someone who hasn't done it before, they typically will ask anywhere from like 1 to 3 questions, and they do need to ask the same questions to every team. But in the prepared events, it's much more fluid. Typically, they won't, I know at least for me, I won't interrupt a presentation to ask a question. I wait till the end. And that's, I think, what judges are told, but different districts may do it differently. Or maybe if they've never judged before, they could potentially interrupt you. Provided there's time, provided your project doesn't go over the allotted time, I typically like to ask at least a couple questions, because I do think it gives us, a better sense of, like Jeff said, do you just memorize this speech and you're just reading it, or do you really, you know, and sometimes I'm just really interested, either like I want to learn more about a particular area that didn't really make sense, or sometimes it's to avoid confusion. And there's also been situations where somebody didn't quite hit something in their rubric, and the question at least lets me try to get it, give them some points. I mean, maybe I'm more generous than others. I don't know if everyone does that, but I want everyone to do as well as possible. So if you didn't get a chance to sort of cover an area, I will often use that as for my questions. So prepared questions. You don't quite get that advantage on a role play, because I do, where judges are given questions and then they can ask whatever they want, but they just have to ask the same questions to everybody.
For prepared events, one of the things that I always make sure to give people the background knowledge on is that, and every district, every state works it differently, but don't always assume that the judge that is evaluating your presentation has seen your paper. In a lot of larger states, especially at ICDC, that's not the case. So what I will use my questions for is to tailor to things that maybe I need more information on, that maybe you addressed in your paper and excluded from your presentation for whatever reason, but I don't have the background of your paper to be able to have that and to look at that. One of the things that I also generally try to do with my questions is, and this is not quite a sadistic trick, but this is, like Katie said, to tell who has just memorized a presentation and a script and who can adapt and think on their feet, is I will typically look for something in your presentation and I may offer some critique to it. I will try to put you on the spot and ask you, okay, why did you do it this particular way? Why did you make this decision? And I'm less concerned about the answer as how you answer it. Do you stumble? Are you able to think quickly on your feet? Are you able to adapt? Because you're going to get into those types of rooms when you're presenting for a company where you are going to have that executive or that person in the room that doesn't buy into the solution or doesn't buy in what you're selling. And you're going to have to defend yourself in that moment. And, the way I typically do it is, I would have someone that maybe their timeline doesn't make sense for a marketing event. And I'll say, well, I'm looking at this and the timeline doesn't really make sense. It really feels like you should have more time for this. Can you explain why you're doing it this way and why you don't think you need to do something longer? And what I'll always look for is, do people double down and defend their idea, or do they kind of turn into the wishy-washy, oh, well, maybe you're right, maybe we can extend it. I want to hear how you defend your opinions and how you defend your ideas. Remember that you've been working on this longer than I have. You know your stuff. I want to hear you know your stuff and apply it.
Thank you.
Great answers, you guys. That was great. All right, Nora.
Hello. So I was just wondering, what are some things you can do in that initial meeting with the judge? Like when you first walk into the room, how should you introduce yourself to them just to make you seem professional and for them to really engage in your conversation for the rest of the role play?
I would say that again, just a natural but professional greeting works. I mean, it's not sort of like the clothing. It's not something you have to overthink. It's not something you have to spend a lot of prep time on. Um, walking up, introducing yourself with your name, offering the handshake, that really is the most you have to think about it. The teams that introduce themselves do get, again, like Alex was saying, when you're going back and reviewing, if you need to rescore, the teams that introduce themselves first can bump up a little, because the teams that just rush in, set everything up, lock their eyes on the room monitor, and then when the room monitor says go, they just start talking, they give the impression that they're rushed, they're anxious, they're not confident. If you walk in and say hi, take the time to shake the hand, it's a little bit of a subtle signal that you're confident enough to take the extra time to make that personal connection, and you're not worried about what you have to say or what you have to present. But I will reiterate, like I said, and has been mentioned before, this is not something you should be worrying over much about. It is not on the rubric. It's a little nudge that might get you an edge, but it is not the main thing you should worry about.
I would also say practice your handshake with someone. Don't, that you can be too strong and you can also have sort of that, dead fish thing. So somewhere in between, shake your parents' hands. See, try just kind of practice so that it feels natural, it doesn't feel awkward. I know it's not something, typical high school kids do every day. So it will feel a little awkward. So do it. Just go around shaking some hands for a couple days until it doesn't feel quite so strange. But also eye contact. Look at the judge when you shake their hands and when you introduce yourself. You don't want to be looking at the ground. You don't want to be looking, everywhere else. Look at your judge, shake their hand, introduce yourself. I would also say one of the things that, can leave an impression is the same thing at the end of the interaction. Don't just rush, finish your project and sort of run away, which, I see particularly at the districts. Take the time to, again, shake the judge's hand, thank them for their time. So you sort of want to close the loop on that so that your initial impression and the impression you leave them with is the same. You don't want to have this great initial impression and then it sort of just ends. So that would be my
The
thing.
thank you is so critical. I would say, if not the most important part that I look for, especially at the end. We all do this volunteer. We don't, none of us get paid to go and do this. A lot of veteran judges like myself, we travel up and down states. We travel across the country. Like, I'm basically taking my entire February off to go and judge at 6 different states. It's not because I get paid or anything. It's because I love doing it. So just that little thank you of like, hey, we appreciate you coming out and doing this, taking the time out of our busy days to, come and speak with you. It's just a little thing that makes a lot of a difference.
I do want to quickly reiterate a point that Katie made. If you're, because I've written it as feedback for teams before, if you're going for the handshake, make sure you can do a handshake. Like, please have at least a little bit of a grip, because a handshake is great, but if you hand someone a boneless hand that they have to grip, it suddenly gets very uncomfortable and awkward. So please practice it.
All right. Great tips on first impressions. All right. Scion.
Sion, but
Okay, Sion.
um, it's okay. I was wondering about the general like setup of the competition itself. Like, are all the like marketing groups going to be presenting like one after the other, or all the finance, all the prepared events? Like, I was wondering if it's going to be mixed and match or like in a specific order.
I can jump in on that. I mean, the way it's done, at least at the district I have judged at, and it's the same way that it's at state. So I imagine it's the same at all districts. Is there you will be in one room for the most part. Sometimes a couple different rooms, but there will be other teams presenting at the same time as you at tables, one in front of the other. And yes, groups are typically together. So, but if whatever category you're in, will go one after the other before the same judge. But that actually is something leads me to a tip is make sure that you're able to project and speak loud enough to get over the noise of all the other people presenting. That doesn't mean you want to shout at your judge, but I mean, I know for me that like my voice is not one that really carries. I know if I were in that situation presenting, and even when I'm asking questions, I do feel like I'm shouting at the teams and they still have sometimes a hard time hearing me. So you do want to make sure that you are speaking loud enough that your judge can hear you. Because if they can't hear what you're saying, it's hard to judge the content of your presentation. So that is something to keep in mind is that the room may be pretty loud and just do the best you can to block out everything around you and really kind of lock in on with your judge and make sure that they can hear you. And it's even okay to say, just to pause and say, can you hear me? Or, I've had teams do that and I appreciate it because it's nice to know that they're being, that they're concerned that you can.
Yeah, and just to build off what Miss Sims says, I would say as a member, my first year going into it, it was the biggest culture shock going into a room and like as soon as they say go, it's like an eruption. Like everyone starts talking their intro. So I would definitely say just get used to that, like expect it because going into it, you're gonna be taken off guard going into it. So just go into practicing knowing that you're going to be presenting in a really loud room and you want to make sure all your attention is on the judge. So that's just from my first year experience. All right, Victoria.
Thank you.
I was
Yeah.
just wondering, like, some tips to like get the performance indicators like naturally because I usually have trouble with that. There's some general tips on how to like make it flow naturally.
I think, I mean, I kind of had mentioned before something, if you feel kind of silly because you're like, well, if that scenario, the role play, for example, is one set up where the person will clearly know what that term is, you can use sort of speech like, as you're aware, or, as we're both really familiar with, this is a really important part of this project, so do the best you can. It's still not going to be necessarily 100% natural. But yeah, just sort of work it into the conversation and say we really want to make sure that we're hitting this, target because it's such important. You don't need to say the words, the definition of this, but if picture it almost like if you were writing it out, there'd be a comma, which is, in define it before you move on.
Everybody has a particular way that they talk, even if you are playing into a different role, even if you're kind of pretending to be somebody else or stepping into that role of a CEO or a marketing manager or whatever the role has. It is easy for us as a judge to look at you and your body language, the way that you present, and see when it doesn't feel like it's natural to you. So that's kind of where it's a difficult thing to master. I will admit I struggled with it when I was a DECA member as well. But think, how do I say this thing, but in my own words and the way that I would talk about it?
Thank you so much.
All right. Do we have any other questions? It could be role play specific, project specific, whatever you guys need. No pressure if you don't. We've had some great answers and they've been very thorough. So,
I
all
would say
right.
one thing and again, saying this as someone who's been a DECA competitor, a lot of you, understand that this is probably going to be your first time. DECA is all a learning experience. The stuff that you are doing, what you are doing right now, it may not seem like it, especially if you're a freshman and this is your very first time ever doing something like this before. But the skills that you're learning right now are going to put you so much further ahead of your peers when you go to apply for college, get your first internship, get your first job. The skills that you're doing right now, thinking critically on your feet, coming up with ideas, problem solving. DECA isn't all about winning trophies and getting medals and getting first place, because the skills that you're learning right now, all the practice that you're doing, it's going to set you up for that future career.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. I have two kids who have gone through DECA. They're both now in college. I have a sophomore who's studying education, and even though she's not in the business world, so many of the skills she learned in presenting, I think, are transferring now to her education major. And my son just started, he's a freshman studying business. And, he had a project this week where he had to build a website and then link to a Google Doc and there, all these skills, he already knew a lot of them because they tied so much into what he was doing in DECA. And he had another presentation in another class, and he was like, "Oh, I'm not worried about that. Like, it's just a presentation." Because he did well. He placed first last year at States, and he came in sixth at ICDC. So, the skills like presenting year after year, he really built those skills. And he didn't start out that way. His freshman year, he didn't make states. And then his sophomore year, he actually, I don't think he made it his sophomore year. In his junior year, he, got third place in his category and only two moved on. So, but every year he got better and better, particularly at the presentation. And it makes such a difference in where he is now. And even I think in the sort of the journey going into business, I don't know that he would have necessarily gone that route if it hadn't been for building those skills. So, even if maybe you don't do the best and you think, oh, I could have done better, well, you've got another year, especially if you're a freshman or sophomore. So
I'm actually
working
a
at
junior,
it.
so I just learned about DECA this year, and I wish I'd learned about it when I was a freshman.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in doing business when I'm older. So these
Yeah,
are good skills I'm learning, and even if I don't go to States, at least I learned some new skills.
Absolutely.
exactly. I would say DECA is like a big learning experience, and I've learned so much about like business and just general professional like environments through DECA. So it's definitely great. All right, Kanika.
Hi, I compete in a role play. So, what visual do you think is most effective for a judge to see? Like, what helps you visualize the competitor's plan?
I go back to what we were saying earlier about your most important thing in the 10 minutes is giving the judge the information so that we know that you understand and not just understand what the performance indicators are, but can apply them successfully. There are plenty of people that I've scored as top competitors and that have moved on to districts or from districts to states and then states to ICDC that have not had a visual. And that's because they focus so much on crafting their thoughts and explaining it, being conversational with the judge. If you have time after you've done all of that, then absolutely, if you spend 90% of your 10-minute prep time and you got a minute left and you want to put together a quick visual, great. But your thoughts and what you're saying matters way more than the little chart visual or the business card that you're creating.
Yeah, I would say anything that you could have prepared ahead of time is probably not that helpful, if that makes sense. I would really say if there's any visuals that add value, it's because they really tie into whatever the role play is. So it's hard to say what that is because without, um, like I guess I can give you an example. In a past role play it had to do with sort of a social media policy. And I think it was a business ethics category. I'm not 100% certain. I've done sort of a variety of them, and I think the visual, what they came up with was a policy change that tied, and they wrote out sort of what the new policy would be, which really did, kind of almost went beyond the the role play and in solving the problem. It was sort of the next level, and I thought that was impressive. Like they understood what the issue was, they solved it, and then they said, "Oh, and here's what we propose the new policy should be." So it's hard to say what the visual would be because I do think it needs to really tie into whatever the role play is.
But the key in that example again is it was an application. Even without that policy or that visual, the application of, oh, here's the next logical thing that we would do is still equally as effective.
Absolutely. I just thought that was like the next step because they were able to even have the time to write out pretty coherent
Yeah.
policy. So
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is, and this applies, I think even to the prepared presentations for like papers, your visuals should be enhancing or supporting what you're saying. If it is just literally repeating information, or if it's not presenting it in any way that you wouldn't just speak it, it's not enhancing anything, and you may as well just skip it.
and yeah, I would agree. And I would also say on the prepared presentations, sort of the most helpful visuals that I feel like I have seen are what I call sort of evidence of your project, particularly in project management or in the OR categories, where it's sort of proof that you really did what you said you did. I think sometimes I see projects where they look and sound great, but then as the person's going through it, it's clear that maybe they're overselling a little bit what they actually did on the project. So, that might be like a letter from an organization that you worked with that thanked you, or, like a certificate of a 501(c)(3) that you created that shows that you really did what you said you did. I think that's tends to be, I don't know if that's for everybody, but I feel like that often leaves an impression like, oh wow, you did this.
One of my favorite visuals that I see in entrepreneurship related events or those that have a financial nexus where you have to put together financial plans and forecasts is if you go to a friend of your family or someone in the community that's an accountant or has a finance degree or major, they specialize in that. And, they write a little letter to say, yep, we validated this and yes, this makes sense given the context in the industry. Again, it's another thing that helps me as a judge understand that you've taken the knowledge, you've applied it, and oh, by the way, the application of it is accurate.
Great. All right, we'll move on to our final question from Siri.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering about how competitors are ranked during districts. Like, do judges rank like their top like 4 or 2 to move on to states, or how does that work?
That might vary by district.
I think it depends on the district.
I happen to know the one I'm judging next week, and I believe the top 6 move on to states. I think that's across all categories, but I could be wrong. So I know at least in the written ones, it's 6.
Your advisor should know as well.
Right.
Yeah. Also, I mean, to a certain extent, they keep the judges in the dark about that a little bit because it's pressure on us when we're judging. It's if like, and sometimes they have to tell us, but if somebody comes over and says, hey, you had a tie between 2 teams, we need you to break that because one of them's moving on and the other one isn't. Suddenly that's like, oh, good, I'm crushing a little child's dreams now. This is wonderful. And that's not a comfortable feeling for us as judges because there are very few presentations that we see during a day that are like horribly bad. Almost all of you, when you are presenting, do an excellent job. You've prepared for it. You've given good information. So to a certain extent, we don't know how they're splitting it up. And I've done it a couple of different years. And sometimes they've got the top 6 moving on. Sometimes they've got the top 3 moving on. That changes depending on what category you're judging. And it also changes depending on how many people are in it. Because when I'm doing prepared presentations, sometimes the category I'm in is so large that I'm judging half of them, and there's a completely different judge that's judging the other half. And the people moving on are split between the 2 of them. So I might be moving on the top 5 people that I rank, but I might be moving on only the top 2. So it changes depending on the circumstances, and it even changes year to year.
And we also only, if you're one of us, if we're judging a prepared or a role play, we're only seeing that portion of it. And a different judge almost always has done the written part of a prepared. And as you guys know that are doing the role plays, you take a test. So we have no control over that. So even if we rank someone, in a top, whatever it is, 6, it doesn't mean that they'll move on depending on how they do on the other portion of their total score.
Generally speaking, in role play based events, 2/3 of your score is going to be your role play. The remaining third is going to be your cluster exam. And then in the event of a tie, generally speaking, the higher test score is the one that breaks the tie.
Yes, exactly. So some great tips there. All right. So that was our final question. If we can all put some thank yous in the chat for our 3 incredible judges. They took the time out of their Friday to come and help us all out. And I hope it showed you guys that, like, even though judges can be very intimidating from across the table, like, they're great, normal people who are super helpful. So trust me when I say, like, if you're nervous going into it, it's understandable, but they're all just normal people who are looking to see how or what everyone's doing in DECA and how great we've been working. So just take that opportunity and show what you know. So big thank you to our judges. Thank you so much. I can't say it enough. But yes, so that was our judge panel. We will be posting this on YouTube if you want to reference it later. But yeah, so I hope everyone has a great night and thank you so much for coming.
Great questions, everybody.
Thank you all, and best of luck at your competitions this year.
Yes.
Thank you
Good
so
luck,
much
everyone.
for the tips. Bye-bye.
Bye.